$53,000 buys a lot of things. A decent truck, a down payment on a shoebox in the suburbs, a year of tuition. What it shouldn't buy is a standoff on a sagging wooden porch with a sheriff's deputy and a woman in a pressed pastel cardigan holding a clipboard like it's a loaded weapon. My signature was barely dry on the deed to the rotting A-frame behind her, yet she was already charging me for trespassing. Desperation smells remarkably like mildew and dead pine needles. When you spend 10 years working mid-level logistics in a concrete sprawl, breathing recycled office air, and watching your rent hike itself up by 10% every January, you start looking for an exit strategy. Mine was a foreclosure auction in a county I had only driven through twice. The listing had exactly 3 photos, all taken from terrible angles, featuring a severely overgrown A-frame cabin perched on a rocky slope. The address was up a winding mountain switchback called Whispering Pines Lane. The opening bid was laughably low. I bought it blindly, standing in front of it for the first time, a week after the gavel fell. The reality of my purchase settled into my bones like a damp chill. The roof shingles were curling backward, brittle and gray like dead leaves. The front porch dipped dangerously in the middle, surrendering to gravity and rot. Nature had spent the last 5 years aggressively reclaiming the property. Blackberry brambles as thick as my thumb choked the lower windows, and a solitary, aggressive sapling had somehow taken root in the rain gutter. It was hideous. It was perfect. It was mine. I spent my first weekend on the mountain, simply fighting my way to the front door with a pair of rusty loppers and a borrowed machete. Inside, the air was stagnant, heavy with the scent of animal droppings, dust, and something sharply metallic. The previous owner had left in a hurry. Faded outlines on the linoleum showed where appliances used to sit. A single, overturned wooden chair rested in the center of the living room, surrounded by a sea of outdated mail and junk circulars. Often, my plan was simple, born of strict financial necessity. I had blown my entire savings on the cash purchase. I needed an absolute minimum of $20,000 to make the place barely habitable. A new roof, rudimentary plumbing repairs, and a deep, hazmat-level cleaning. I couldn't afford to live there while I worked, and I couldn't afford to quit my job in the city yet. So, I bought 3 heavy-duty padlocks, a stack of half-inch plywood, and a box of 3-inch galvanized screws. I spent 2 grueling days sealing the cabin. I drilled the plywood over the cracked lower windows. I chained the front gate, wrapping a thick logging chain around the stone pillars that marked my property line. I secured the front door with a heavy-duty hasp and the thickest master lock the hardware store sold. I wanted the house to look impregnable. I wanted it to say, "Go away, this is handled." As I was hammering the final nail into a sheet of plywood over the back sliding door, I felt the distinct prickle of being watched. I wiped the sweat from my forehead with the back of a filthy glove and turned. About 50 yards down the slope, through a break in the dying pine trees, stood a man. He was leaning heavily on a carved wooden walking stick, wearing a faded red flannel shirt and a baseball cap pulled low. He didn't wave. He didn't speak. He just watched me with the still, unblinking focus of a predator deciding if you were worth the calories. "Morning," I yelled out, my voice cracking slightly in the thin mountain air. He didn't respond. He simply turned and vanished into the tree line, silent as smoke. I brushed it off. Mountain people were notoriously private. That was the whole point of moving up here. Nobody cared about your lawn. Nobody cared if your truck leaked a little oil on the gravel. You were left alone. Or so I thought. I locked the final padlock, yanked down on it twice to ensure it was seated, and walked back to my truck. I took one last look at the boarded-up, feral A-frame. It looked like a bruised eye on the side of the mountain, but it was a foundation. I would go back to the city, work 70-hour weeks for 6 straight months, hoard every spare cent, and return in the spring with a truckload of drywall and a fresh start. The drive back down the mountain was quiet. The gravel crunched under my tires, spitting dust into the rearview mirror. I didn't notice the pristine white sign planted near the bottom of the main switchback, partially obscured by an overgrown rhododendron bush. If I had stopped to read it, I might have reconsidered everything. It read, "Welcome to Whispering Pines." A managed community. 6 months in the city passed in a blur of spreadsheets, fluorescent lights, and instant noodles. Every time my manager threw a tantrum over a delayed shipment, I pulled up the single decent photo of my cabin on my phone. Just a little longer, I told myself, just until the frost breaks. By late April, the snow melt had finished. I had $22,000 sitting in a checking account, a truck bed groaning under the weight of tools, generator fuel, and basic building supplies, and a notice of resignation officially accepted by my boss. I was going home. I was going to my mountain. The drive up Highway 9 takes about 4 hours from the city. You watch the landscape transition from brutalist concrete overpasses to sprawling suburban strip malls, and finally into the jagged, ancient spine of the mountain range. The air gets thinner. The radio stations drop off one by one, giving way to static and the occasional bursts of a crackling preacher. I drove with the windows rolled down, letting the biting pine-scented wind whip through the cab of my truck. I was exhausted, running on 4 hours of sleep and gas station coffee, but a tight, anxious knot of excitement sat in my chest. Today was day 1. The teardown. Ripping up the rotted floors, tearing down the water-damaged drywall. My truck ground its way up the steep incline of Whispering Pines Lane. The road was worse than I remembered, heavily rutted from the winter's snowplows and spring runoff. I navigated a particularly nasty washout, my tires slipping and catching on the loose gravel before rounding the final blind curve that led to my driveway. I pressed the brake pedal so hard my calf cramped. The truck skidded to a halt in a cloud of dry, gray dust. I stared through the windshield, my brain struggling to process the scene blocking my path. My heavy logging chain was gone. The stone pillars were still there, but the chain had been cut and discarded into the ditch like trash. Parked diagonally across the mouth of my driveway was a pristine white Lexus SUV. Behind it, parked closer to the cabin itself, was a county sheriff's cruiser. Its light bar wasn't flashing, but the sheer presence of the vehicle was enough to send a cold spike of adrenaline straight into my gut. And then there was the house. The plywood I had painstakingly measured, cut, and screwed into the window frames? Gone. The heavy-duty padlock on the front door? Missing. Instead, a bright orange sticker was slapped haphazardly across the center of the wooden front door, glaring in the late morning sun. Standing on my sagging, dangerous front porch was a woman. She looked entirely out of place, like someone had cut a figure out of a country club brochure and pasted it onto a feral mountain backdrop. She wore a pale yellow cardigan, crisp white slacks, and a pair of sensible, spotless loafers. A pair of oversized designer sunglasses rested on top of her meticulously highlighted blonde hair. She was holding a thick, silver metal clipboard. Next to her stood a county deputy. He was a younger guy, mid-20s maybe, shifting his weight uncomfortably from foot to foot. He had his thumbs hooked into his duty belt, looking anywhere but at the woman beside him. I put the truck in park. The transmission clunked loudly in the quiet mountain air. I stepped out, my boots hitting the dirt with a heavy thud. I didn't reach for my tools. I just walked forward, the gravel crunching under my feet, my jaw setting into a hard line. "Can I help you?" I asked. My voice was dangerously calm, carrying easily across the distance between us. The woman looked up from her clipboard. She didn't flinch. She didn't look surprised. Instead, a tight, artificial smile stretched across her face. It was the kind of smile you give a stray dog before you call animal control. "You must be the contractor," she called out, her voice a sharp, nasal chirp that grated against the silence of the trees. "You're late, and you can't park that monstrosity right on the road. You need to move it to the lower visitor lot." I stopped at the edge of the Lexus, resting my hand lightly on the warm hood. "I'm not a contractor. I own the property. Who are you, and why did someone cut my gate chain?" The artificial smile vanished, replaced instantly by a look of profound, deeply ingrained annoyance. She tapped her pen against the metal clipboard. Clack, clack, clack. "Excuse me?" she said, stepping off the porch and walking toward me. Her loafers stepped carefully around the deeper ruts in the dirt. "You're Silas, the new title holder of Lot 42? "I'm Silas, and it's not Lot 42, it's 11,400 Whispering Pines. Now I'm going to ask you one more time before I ask the deputy to start taking statements. Who cut my chain?" She let out a short, breathy laugh. It was entirely devoid of humor. "I did. Well, the community maintenance crew did, under my direct authorization. I am Brenda Carmichael, president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association." I stared at her. The words take a moment to compute. Homeowners Association. We are 20 miles from a grocery store. Half the houses up here are built out of recycled shipping containers and off-grid solar panels. There is no HOA. Brenda straightened her spine, her shoulders pulling back. There absolutely is an HOA, instituted 3 years ago to protect property values from situations exactly like this. She gestured vaguely at my house with her pen. When you purchased Lot 42 at auction, you automatically absorbed the deed restrictions, which you have flagrantly ignored for 6 months. You abandoned a blighted structure. You secured it with unapproved, frankly hideous plywood materials, creating an eyesore and a massive liability. "I bought it in November," I said, my voice dropping an octave. "I secured it so animals and drifters wouldn't gut the copper while I saved money for the renovation. It's private property." "It is a community hazard," Brenda corrected, stepping closer. I could smell her perfume. It was heavily floral and entirely suffocating. Section 4, Paragraph 8 of the community bylaws clearly states that any property left in a state of severe disrepair for more than 90 days is subject to emergency reclamation by the board. Reclamation. I tasted a sharp, sour, metallic flavor at the back of my throat. I looked past her, toward the cabin. The front door was slightly ajar. The padlock wasn't just missing. The entire hasp had been pried off, splintering the aged wood of the doorframe. I took a step toward the house. The young deputy finally moved, stepping down from the porch and raising a hand, palm out. "Hold on, sir. Let's just keep things calm here." I looked at his name tag, Hayes. "Deputy Hayes," I said, keeping my hands visible but moving steadily forward until I was toe-to-toe with Brenda. She didn't back down, holding her clipboard against her chest like a piece of composite armor. "I need you to arrest this woman for trespassing, breaking and entering, and vandalism." Hayes grimaced, looking incredibly tired for a man his age. "Sir, it's a civil matter. Miss Carmichael presented me with the HOA covenant documents this morning. They have a clause about entering properties to abate nuisances." "Abate nuisances?" I barked a laugh. She drilled my locks. "We secured the property," Brenda countered smoothly. "The plywood was a code violation. It was removed. The interior was full of trash. It was a fire hazard. The board voted to have it cleared out." My blood ran cold. The chair. The old mail. I didn't care about that. But in the back bedroom, tucked beneath a heavy canvas tarp, I had left a brand new $2,000 portable generator, my table saw, and 3 crates of high-end hand tools I couldn't fit in my apartment. "You went inside?" I asked. The anger was gone, replaced by a terrifying absolute clarity. Brenda smiled again, the stray dog smile. "The contractors we hired went inside. And honestly, Silas, you should be thanking us. We hauled away 4 cubic yards of debris. We're only billing you for the labor and the disposal fees, which, along with your fines for the unapproved fencing, the plywood, and the general neglect, brings your current balance with the HOA to..." She flipped a page on her clipboard, running a manicured fingernail down a ledger. $14,250. Payment is due within 30 days, or we will be forced to place a lien on the house. Silence dropped over the driveway, heavy and absolute. The only sound was the distant wind moving through the canopy of the pine trees. I looked at Brenda. I looked at the $14,000 figure, typed neatly on the bottom of her spreadsheet. Then I looked at Deputy Hayes. "Let me get this straight," I said, pointing a finger at Brenda, but keeping my eyes locked on the cop. "She cuts my chain. She rips down the barriers securing my house. She hires a private company to break my door open, steal my property, and haul it away. And you are standing here telling me this is a civil matter? Deputy Hayes adjusted his duty belt, looking deeply miserable. Sir, the HOA bylaws. I didn't sign any bylaws, I shouted, the restraint finally cracking. I bought this property from a county tax auction. There was no HOA mentioned in the deed transfer. There were no covenants attached to the title. Brenda clicked her pen. It sounded like a gunshot in the quiet air. Ignorance of the community covenants does not exempt you from them, Silas. The HOA was legally incorporated. We filed the master deed with the county clerk. When you take ownership of a lot within the boundaries of Whispering Pines, you belong to the HOA, period. She held out a thick stack of stapled papers toward me. I didn't take them. I'm not touching your garbage, I said. I pushed past her, walking purposefully toward the house. Sir, you cannot enter the structure, Brenda snapped, her voice rising in pitch, the polished veneer cracking just a fraction. It has been deemed structurally unsafe by the Community Architectural Committee. I own the damn committee, I yelled back over my shoulder, taking the front porch steps 2 at a time. The wood groaned under my weight, a familiar, comforting sound amidst the madness. I pushed the heavy front door open. The smell of dust and animal droppings was gone. Instead, the cabin reeked of industrial bleach and cheap pine cleaner. The living room was entirely empty. The overturned wooden chair was gone. I walked quickly toward the back hallway, my boots echoing hollowly on the bare linoleum. I turned the corner into the back bedroom. Empty. The canvas tarp was gone. The generator. The table saw. The 3 heavy black tool crates containing years of accumulated, expensive equipment. All gone. They had stripped the room down to the bare drywall. I stood in the empty room for a long moment. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, fighting the sudden, violent urge to walk back out to the driveway and put a rock through the windshield of the white Lexus. Think, I told myself. If you lose your temper, you lose the war. She wants you to scream. She wants Hayes to arrest you. I opened my eyes, turned around, and walked back out to the porch. Brenda and Deputy Hayes were standing exactly where I left them. Brenda had a smug, self-satisfied look on her face, perfectly confident that she held all the cards. She was playing a game of suburban warfare, using paperwork and bylaws to bully people out of their homes. "Where's my generator?" I asked, leaning against a porch support beam and crossing my arms. Brenda blinked. "Excuse me?" "My generator. A Honda EU 3000 IS, brand new. It was under a tarp in the back bedroom, along with a DeWalt table saw and about $3,000 worth of hand tools. You said your guys hauled away debris. Where are my tools?" Brenda's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before snapping back into place. "The contractors were instructed to clear out all abandoned property and debris. If there were tools left in a derelict, unsecured building, they were likely cataloged as junk and disposed of." "Disposed of where?" "At the county dump, I imagine," she said dismissively, waving her hand. "Really, Silas, if you cared about your belongings, you shouldn't have abandoned them in a rotting shack." I looked at Deputy Hayes. "Deputy, I am officially reporting a grand larceny. Over $5,000 worth of equipment was stolen from this property. This woman just admitted to hiring the people who did it and authorizing the removal of my property." Hayes sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Miss Carmichael, is that true? Did your crew remove tools?" "It was debris," Brenda insisted, her voice sharp. "The man is lying to build a case. There was nothing in there but rat-infested trash and broken glass." "I have the receipts," I said quietly. "I bought the generator 2 days before I drove up here last November. I have the serial number registered. If your contractors fenced it, I'll find it. If they pawned it, I'll find it. And when I do, I'm pressing criminal charges against them, and against you for ordering the theft." Brenda's face flushed, an ugly, blotchy red beneath her makeup. "You are completely out of line. You are a blight on this community. You owe us $14,000, and until you pay it, we have the legal right to bar you from initiating any unapproved construction." "You're not barring me from anything," I said, walking down the steps and stopping inches from her face. I had 6 inches and 80 pounds on her. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten her. I just stared down at her with cold, dead eyes. "You have 30 seconds to get off my property, both of you. I am the president of—" 20 seconds. Deputy Hayes put a hand on Brenda's elbow. "Come on, Miss Carmichael. We've served the notice. Let's head back." She yanked her arm away from the cop, her eyes blazing. "This isn't over. You have 30 days to pay the fine, Silas. If you don't, I will auction this eyesore out from under you, and don't you dare try to bring a hammer onto this lot without an approved permit from my committee." She turned on her heel and marched back to her Lexus. Deputy Hayes lingered for a moment. "Look, man," Hayes muttered, keeping his voice low. "She's a nightmare. She moved up here from California 2 years ago and organized the HOA out of a few of the newer builds down the mountain. But she's got a lawyer on retainer. You need to be careful. Don't do anything stupid." "I appreciate the advice, Deputy," I said evenly. "Now please leave my property." Hayes nodded once, walked back to his cruiser, and climbed in. I watched as Brenda threw her Lexus into reverse, spinning her tires unnecessarily in the dirt, and sped down the driveway, the cruiser following slowly behind. I stood in the silence of the driveway for a long time. The dust settled slowly over my boots. $14,000 in fines. My tools gone. The house stripped bare. She thought she had broken me on day one. She thought I was just some dumb city kid who got in over his head and would fold the moment a lawyer's letter hit my mailbox. I walked over to the ditch, picked up my heavy severed logging chain, and dragged it back to the stone pillars. I didn't have my tools, but I had a crowbar in my truck, a cell phone, and enough spite to burn the whole mountain down. Brenda Carmichael wanted a war over a rotting A-frame. She had no idea how feral I was willing to get. The first night on my property, I slept in the cab of my truck. April in the mountains is a liar. The sun might warm the dirt during the day, but the moment it dips behind the ridge, the temperature plummets, stripping the heat from your bones. I parked the truck as close to the boarded-up front porch as I could, locked the doors, and buried myself under a pile of moving blankets. I ate a can of cold baked beans by the light of a headlamp. I didn't sleep. Every time the wind ripped through the pine branches, my hand drifted to the heavy steel tire iron, sitting on the passenger seat. I was furious, but anger is a terribly inefficient fuel. It burns hot, and then it leaves you empty. I needed data. I spent a decade managing supply chains. I knew that when someone is trying to screw you, they usually leave a paper trail. You just have to know which rock to overturn. At dawn, I drove back down the mountain. The white sign for Whispering Pines mocked me from the brush as I turned onto the highway. I drove straight to the county seat, a dying logging town anchored by a brutalist concrete courthouse that looked like a Soviet bunker. I was waiting on the steps when the doors unlocked at 8. The county register of deeds was located in a windowless basement room that smelled of old dust, floor wax, and misery. Behind a thick sheet of plexiglass sat a woman in her late 50s, wearing a faded knitted sweater and a pair of reading glasses perched precariously on the end of her nose. Her name tag read, "Martha. Can I help you?" she asked, not looking up from a stack of manila folders. "I need to pull the master deed and the covenants for a subdivision called Whispering Pines," I said, sliding my driver's license under the glass slot. "And I need the tax foreclosure history for Lot 42, 11400 Whispering Pines Lane." Martha sighed, the universal sound of a government employee being asked to do their job. She tapped her keyboard with a heavy, deliberate rhythm. 5 minutes later, she returned from a back room with 2 thick files and dropped them onto the counter. "Copies are 50 cents a page," she said dryly. I opened the first file. It was the HOA master deed filed by Brenda Carmichael 3 years ago. I skimmed through the pages of aggressively detailed restrictions, approved exterior paint colors, allowable grass lengths, mandatory fines for visible trash cans. It was a masterclass in suburban tyranny, but it wasn't what I was looking for. I opened the second file, the property history for my cabin. I traced the timeline with my index finger, comparing the dates between the two files. The original owner of the A-frame had died. His estate sat in probate, ignored, while the property taxes went unpaid for 4 years. The county seized the property in a tax foreclosure 2.5 years ago. I looked at the date Brenda incorporated the HOA 3 years ago, but the boundaries of her HOA map only included the lower, newer section of the mountain. I flipped through the amendments. Brenda had filed an expansion of the HOA boundaries to include the upper mountain, my lot, 18 months ago. A slow, grim realization spread through my chest. "Martha," I asked, keeping my voice level, "if a property is taken by the county in a tax foreclosure, what happens to encumbrances placed on the property while it sits in the county's inventory?" Martha finally looked up. Her eyes narrowed, assessing me. She pushed her glasses up her nose. "A tax foreclosure washes the title clean. Any junior liens, private agreements, or unrecorded encumbrances are wiped out. But when the county auctions it, they sell it free and clear. And if a homeowners association tries to annex the property into their boundaries while the county holds the deed," Martha let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh. "The county doesn't join HOAs, honey. They can draw all the maps they want, unless the county commissioners specifically signed a document legally binding that tax-seized parcel to the HOA covenants, which they absolutely never do. The annexation is invalid. I bought the property from the county. The deed I held was clean. Brenda hadn't just overstepped. She had committed fraud. She had illegally annexed my property on paper to inflate the size of her fiefdom, knowing the county wouldn't notice and assuming whoever bought the ruined cabin would be too stupid to check. "One more thing," I said, my heart pounding a steady, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I pulled the $14,000 invoice Brenda had given me from my jacket pocket and flattened it against the glass. "This bill mentions a contractor who hauled away my property. Pristine Mountain Services. Do you have a business license on file for them?" Martha typed. A few seconds later, she turned the monitor slightly so I could see it. "Pristine Mountain Services, LLC, registered agent, Kyle Carmichael." "Carmichael," Martha noted, leaning back in her squeaky office chair. "Same last name as the lady who filed that HOA paperwork. Ain't that a coincidence?" "No," I said, a slow, cold smile spreading across my face for the first time in 2 days. "It's a business model." I paid Martha $20 for certified copies of everything, leaving the change in her tip jar. I didn't just have a defense anymore, I had a weapon. I drove straight to the hardware store in town. If Brenda wanted a war over community standards, I was going to give her a visual masterpiece. I couldn't secure the house with plywood anymore. She had proven she would just tear it down and charge me for the privilege. I needed something legal, structurally unassailable, and blindingly offensive to her delicate suburban sensibilities. I bought 6 heavy-duty, neon orange construction tarps. The kind they use on highway projects that reflect sunlight with enough intensity to cause a migraine. I bought 500 feet of bright yellow nylon rope, a staple gun, and 4 cans of highly reflective silver spray paint. I arrived back at the cabin by noon. The mountain was quiet. The white Lexus nowhere to be seen. I went to work. I draped the neon orange tarps over the exposed front windows, stapling them securely to the wooden frames. The vibrant, synthetic orange screamed against the natural greens and browns of the forest. I took the yellow nylon rope and created a dense, chaotic spiderweb across the sagging front porch, weaving it back and forth between the support beams. It looked like a crime scene cordoned off by a madman. Then I took the silver spray paint and walked down to the stone pillars at the end of my driveway. Across the smooth gray rock, in jagged letters 2 feet high, I painted, "Federal No Trespassing Zone. Survivors will be prosecuted." It was ugly. It was an absolute eyesore. And according to the county building codes I had just read, temporary weatherproofing materials and private property signage were entirely exempt from permit requirements. I stepped back to admire my work. The A-frame now looked less like an abandoned cabin and more like a biohazard quarantine zone. Brenda's head was going to explode. But the aesthetics were just bait. I needed my tools. I pulled out my phone and searched for the registered address of Pristine Mountain Services. It wasn't a commercial lot. It was a residential address located on the lower paved section of Whispering Pines Lane, the heart of Brenda's territory. I got in my truck and rolled down the mountain. The lower section of the community looked completely different from my Farrell Ridge. The trees were manicured. The driveways were paved with stamped concrete. Massive, modern log cabins sat on perfectly graded lots, exuding quiet, aggressive wealth. I found Kyle Carmichael's address. It was a sprawling 3-story cedar home with a massive detached garage. I parked my truck down the street, out of sight, and walked back up the road, slipping into the tree line that bordered his property. I crouched behind a thick stand of juniper bushes and watched the house. For an hour, nothing happened. Then a silver-lifted pickup truck rumbled up the driveway. A young guy in his 20s wearing a backwards baseball cap and expensive sunglasses hopped out. He walked around to the back of the truck and dropped the tailgate. My stomach tightened. Sitting in the bed of his truck, shining in the afternoon sun, was my red Honda EU 3000 IS generator. Next to it were my 3 black heavy-duty tool crates. Kyle hadn't taken them to the dump. He had just stolen them and kept them for his own business. I didn't storm down the hill. I didn't yell. I pulled out my phone, took 3 clear, zoomed-in photos of Kyle wrestling my generator out of his truck bed, and dialed the county sheriff's non-emergency dispatch line. "I need to speak to Deputy Hayes," I said when the operator answered. "Tell him Silas is calling from Whispering Pines. Tell him I found my stolen property and I am standing 30 feet away from the thief. He has 20 minutes to get here before I execute a citizen's arrest." Hayes arrived in 14. His cruiser pulled up silently, parking next to my truck. I stepped out of the woods to meet him. He looked frustrated, his hand resting instinctively on his belt. "Silas, what did I tell you about doing something stupid?" Hayes sighed. "I didn't do anything stupid, Deputy. I did your job," I said, handing him my phone. "Swipe through those. That's Kyle Carmichael, Brenda Carmichael's nephew. He owns the contracting company she hired to break into my house yesterday. He has my generator and my tools in his garage right now." Hayes looked at the photos. His jaw set. The weariness in his eyes shifted into professional annoyance. "Are you absolutely sure it's yours?" I reached into my pocket and handed him the original hardware store receipt, along with the warranty registration card bearing the serial number. "Check the serial. It's mine. She used HOA authority to authorize her nephew to rob me." Hayes didn't say another word. He turned on his heel and walked up Kyle's stamped concrete driveway. I followed a few paces behind. The garage door was wide open. Kyle was standing at a workbench, casually wiping down my DeWalt table saw with a rag. He looked up as Hayes approached, his arrogant posture faltering at the sight of the uniform. "Can I help you, officer?" Kyle asked, trying to sound casual. His voice cracked slightly. "Step away from the workbench, Kyle," Hayes said, his voice carrying an authoritative weight that hadn't been there yesterday. He walked straight over to the red Honda generator, crouched down, and checked the metal plate riveted to the side. He pulled my warranty card from his pocket and compared the numbers. He stood up and looked at Kyle. "Where did you get this equipment?" Kyle swallowed hard, looking from Hayes to me. He finally seemed to recognize me from the driveway yesterday. Panic flared in his eyes. "My aunt. She authorized a clean-out on a derelict property up the ridge. She said it was abandoned trash." "Does this look like trash to you?" I asked, stepping into the garage. "It's brand new equipment." "She told me to take it." Kyle backpedaled, his hands going up in surrender. He folded faster than a cheap card table. "She wrote the work order. I just hauled it away like she asked. She said the guy wasn't coming back and we could use the stuff for the maintenance company." Hayes pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt. The metallic click echoed loudly in the cavernous garage. "Kyle Carmichael, turn around and place your hands behind your back. You're under arrest for grand larceny and possession of stolen property." "Wait, no wait," Kyle practically shrieked, backing away. "Call my aunt. She's the HOA president. She authorized it. Your aunt doesn't write the penal code, Hayes said, grabbing Kyle's arm and spinning him around, slapping the cuffs on his wrists with practiced efficiency. I stood in the driveway and watched as Hayes marched a weeping Kyle Carmichael out to the cruiser. I loaded my generator and my tool crates back into the bed of my own truck. The weight of the heavy plastic handles in my hands felt like absolute victory. But I wasn't done. Kyle was just a greedy kid following orders. The real disease was Brenda, and I knew exactly how to eradicate her. The Whispering Pines Homeowners Association held its monthly board meetings on the first Tuesday of every month in the clubhouse of the neighboring golf course resort down in the valley. I didn't bother changing my clothes. I wore my scuffed work boots, dust-covered denim, and a faded flannel shirt. I grabbed the thick manila envelope containing my county records and walked through the heavy glass double doors of the clubhouse at exactly 7 p.m. The room was bathed in warm, amber light, smelling of expensive catered coffee and nervous tension. About 40 people sat in folding chairs, facing a long folding table at the front. Sitting at the center of the table, flanked by two uncomfortable-looking board members, was Brenda Carmichael. She looked immaculate as always, in a navy blue blazer. But the tight, self-satisfied smile was gone. Her face was drawn, her eyes darting nervously around the room. Kyle's arrest had clearly sent shockwaves through her fragile empire. She was mid-sentence when I pushed through the back doors, and despite the unfortunate misunderstandings regarding local contractors, we must maintain our commitment to the aesthetic integrity of... Brenda stopped dead. Her eyes locked onto me. The color drained from her face, leaving her pale and hollow beneath her makeup. The room went dead silent. 40 heads turned to look at me. I walked slowly down the center aisle, the heavy tread of my boots thudding against the carpet. I didn't stop until I was standing directly in front of the board's table. "Silas," Brenda said, her voice shaking violently. She gripped her gavel like a life preserver. "You are not permitted here. This is a closed meeting for members in good standing. You are delinquent on your fines. Leave immediately, or I will call the police." "I strongly encourage you to call the police, Brenda," I said, my voice calm, projecting clearly to the back of the room. "Deputy Hayes and I have become quite friendly over the last 48 hours. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. A few people exchanged nervous glances. "Security," Brenda barked, half standing from her chair. No one moved. Whispering Pines didn't have security. It just had Brenda and her clipboard. "I'm not leaving," I said. I slammed the heavy manila envelope down onto the folding table. It landed with a loud, satisfying smack, making the two board members jump. "Because I'm not in your HOA, and I never was." "That is a lie," Brenda hissed, leaning forward. "Lot 42 is clearly delineated on the master map." "The map you drew 18 months ago," I interrupted, pulling the certified deed from the envelope and sliding it across the table toward the other two board members. "While the property was owned by the county due to tax foreclosure, a fact you conveniently ignored." I turned to face the room. These people were older, mostly retirees and affluent vacation homeowners who had let Brenda bully them into submission because fighting her was too exhausting. It was time to show them the monster had no teeth. "My name is Silas," I announced to the crowd. "I bought the A-frame up on the ridge. 2 days ago, Brenda sent her nephew, Kyle, to break into my house, rip off the locks, and steal over $5,000 worth of my tools." Gasps echoed across the room. An older man in the third row stood up. "Is that true, Brenda? Did Kyle rob this man?" "It was an authorized clean-out," Brenda shrieked, losing her composure entirely. Her polished veneer shattered, revealing the desperate, grasping control freak underneath. "The property was a blight. It was lowering our values. I have the authority to abate nuisances." "You don't have authority over dirt," I said, turning back to her. "I went to the county clerk today. A tax foreclosure wipes out unrecorded encumbrances. The county never signed your annexation paperwork. Legally, my property is an island. I don't belong to your HOA. You broke into a private, unaffiliated home." I pulled the police report from the envelope and held it up. Kyle Carmichael was arrested this afternoon for grand larceny, I said loudly, ensuring every person in the room heard the words. He confessed on body cam to Deputy Hayes. He admitted that Brenda ordered him to take my equipment, which he then kept in his own garage. The room erupted. People were standing up, shouting over each other. The two board members sitting next to Brenda pushed their chairs away from her, looking at her with absolute horror. "Order! Order!" Brenda screamed, banging her gavel frantically against the table. The sound was drowned out by the chaos of 40 angry homeowners who had finally smelled blood in the water. I leaned over the table, bringing my face inches from hers. She shrank back, her eyes wide, the gavel trembling in her hand. "You billed me $14,000 for stealing my own property," I said, keeping my voice low so only she could hear it. "I am pressing charges against you for conspiracy to commit theft, breaking and entering, and fraud. I am filing a civil suit for the damages to my front door, and just as a personal favor." I smiled, cold and hard. "I'm keeping the neon orange tarps on my windows until the snow falls. Every time you drive up that mountain, you're going to look at my house and remember that you picked a fight with a man who had absolutely nothing to lose." Brenda opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She looked at the angry crowd, then down at the county documents proving her fraud, and finally back at me. The realization washed over her, heavy and inescapable. She was done. The fiefdom had fallen. I didn't wait for her to cry. I didn't wait for the meeting to devolve into a full-blown riot. I turned around and walked back up the center aisle. As I pushed the glass doors open, I heard the older man in the third row shout, "I make a motion for the immediate removal of Brenda Carmichael as president." The chorus of seconds followed me out into the cool mountain evening. The air on the mountain felt fundamentally different the next morning. Lighter. Or maybe that was just the absence of a $14,000 phantom debt hanging over my head. I drove up Whispering Pines Lane with the windows down, listening to the satisfying crunch of gravel beneath my tires. I didn't see the white Lexus parked by the community sign. I wouldn't see it again for a very long time. Rumors on a mountain travel faster than a crown fire. By noon, Deputy Hayes had driven up the switchbacks to my lot, supposedly just to check on the property line. He left his cruiser idling by the stone pillars, leaned against the hood with a cup of gas station coffee in his hand, and gave me the rundown. Brenda had resigned before the board could even formally draft the motion to vote her out. Her lawyer had spent the entire morning doing rapid damage control with the county prosecutor's office. To avoid a brutal set of felony conspiracy and fraud charges, she had agreed to a rapid plea deal. It involved heavy restitution, fully covering my shattered door frame, the destroyed logging chain, and a hefty premium for my time, distress, and the cost of the original auction. Kyle was facing 3 years of probation, massive fines, and the permanent revocation of his commercial business license. Just like that, the empire of pressed slacks and silver clipboards crumbled into dust. "She put her house on the market this morning," Hayes mentioned casually, staring out over the jagged tree line. "Listed at 20 grand below market value for a quick cash sale. Wants to move back to the coast. Says the mountain air doesn't agree with her." "It's thin up here," I replied, entirely deadpan. "Takes a strong set of lungs to survive it." Hayes chuckled, tipped his hat, and climbed back into his cruiser. I was finally alone. I grabbed my heavy steel crowbar and walked up to the sagging front porch. The neon orange tarps were loud, obnoxious, and utterly victorious. I stared at them for a long moment, listening to the wind snap the plastic against the window frames. Then I dug the claw of the pry bar under the first staple and yanked. Spite is a fantastic catalyst, but it's a terrible foundation. You can't build a home on anger. Now that the war was won, the actual work had to begin. I spent the next 3 days tearing the house apart from the inside out. The red Honda generator hummed faithfully in the front yard, powering my saw, my heavy halogen work lights, and a battered small radio that drifted in and out of a classic rock station. I ripped up the water-damaged linoleum in the kitchen, exposing the original oak subfloor underneath. It was filthy, stained with animal droppings and years of profound neglect. But when I ran a heavy-duty belt sander over the boards, the rich, golden grain of the wood bled through the grime. It was solid. The bones were good. I worked until my muscles cramped and my hands were blistered beneath my leather gloves. I stripped the rotting, moldy drywall in the back bedroom, bagging up decades of accumulated trash. I replaced the shattered front door frame, measuring the cuts on my return DeWalt table saw, the blade screaming through the fresh pine. Every nail I drove, every galvanized screw I sank, felt like driving a physical stake into the ground, claiming it, earning it. By the end of the second week, the A-frame didn't look like a biohazard quarantine zone anymore. It didn't look like a country club chalet either. It looked like a working man's cabin, rough around the edges, structurally sound and fiercely independent. I built a new front deck. I used thick, pressure-treated lumber, sinking the heavy posts deep into the mountain dirt and securing them with fast-setting concrete. Oh, I didn't pull a permit for the deck. I didn't have to. Without Brenda's fraudulent HOA map dictating my life, my property reverted to standard county zoning, which meant out here, in the unincorporated woods, I was the undisputed king of my own dirt. On a Friday evening, just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the jagged western ridge of the mountain, I carried a single aluminum lawn chair out onto the freshly built porch. The wood still smelled sharply of copper and chemical treatment. I cracked open a cold beer. The hiss of the aluminum tab broke the profound, heavy silence of the woods. I sat down and looked out over the valley. Down below, the manicured lawns and stamped concrete driveways of the lower subdivision were already swallowed by the mountain's creeping shadow. But up here, perched right on the edge of the wilderness, the last golden light of the day caught the tops of the ancient pine trees, turning them a fiery, brilliant orange. There was no traffic, no sirens, no manager emailing me demanding immediate updates on shipping logs, just the wind pushing through the branches and the distant, rhythmic drumming of a woodpecker. I took a long pull from the bottle, feeling the cold liquid wash the dry, chalky taste of drywall dust from the back of my throat. Although I was broke again, the building materials had eaten through the rest of my savings, and my back ached with a dull, persistent throb that would probably take a week to fully fade. I didn't have running water yet, and the roof still needed a massive patching job before the autumn rains hit. But as I looked at the heavy steel padlock securing my new front door and the clean, unbroken logging chain draped across the stone pillars at the bottom of the driveway, a strange, entirely unfamiliar sensation settled deep into my chest. Peace. $53,000 buys a lot of things. But sitting there on a porch I built with my own two hands, on a mountain that belonged entirely to me, I finally realized something. It had bought me the only thing that actually mattered: freedom. If you've ever wanted to fight back against a tyrant with a clipboard, hit that like button. Sometimes all it takes is a little malicious compliance and a trip to the county clerk's office to reclaim your peace. Subscribe to the channel for more stories of surviving nightmare neighbors, real estate revenge, and DIY renovations out in the wild. Drop a comment below. Have you ever had an HOA try to steal your property? Share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that the bullies don't always win. Until next time, keep your tools locked and your deeds clean.